Hello everyone. We are going to do 9.5. I'm going to do two different videos. We're going to have 2 different days of assignments for our very last section here in chapter 9. All right, so 9.5 is all about, we can see here, our quadratic formula. We learned already in 9.2, we learned how to solve these different equations when we have the graph. We learned how to solve with square roots just earlier this week. And now we have a formula that we can basically use on any quadratic. So if we don't have a graph, if it doesn't work with square roots, now we can use this quadratic formula. If it doesn't factor, now we can find some more complex answers to these different quadratic equations. All right, so here is the formula right here. You've probably seen this before. All right, maybe you weren't sure what it was for. Maybe you've used it before, maybe you haven't. I will link in Schoology, I will link to some of the songs. I'm not going to subject you to me singing, but usually that's how I can remember the formulas. I think back to the songs that I've been shown, but it's x is equal to, right, the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. That seems very complicated, but I'll show you how to plug everything into there. Again, I'm not expecting you to memorize this. You always have your notes when you're taking your quizzes and your tests and everything. So just make sure you're paying attention. We'll explain a little bit here how to actually plug in all of your values in order to solve out this quadratic formula. Right? And then on the day 2, we have 2 days of these of this lesson. I'm going to go into what the discriminant is, what we use it for, but just so we're aware, it's just that little part that goes under the radical, that goes under the square root sign, the b squared minus 4ac. All right. So before we solve out a whole problem, I'm just going to show you how do I plug in these values into my quadratic formula. This is similar. We've got our quadratic equation. It's in standard form. If it's not already in standard form, you need to do some algebra to get it there. So if I gave you something like 7x squared plus 8 equal to 3x, you can't just go ahead and plug that into the quadratic formula. It's got to be in this arrangement. It's got to be in standard form. So you want all of your terms over on one side equal to 0. So you're going to have to subtract out this 3x from each side. Don't trip yourself up. The 7x squared and the 3x are not going to combine. You've got 7x squared minus 3x plus 8 equal to 0. Now I can look at this and I can see I've got my A, my B, and my C. Always want to make sure it's in standard form. If you had put 7x squared plus 8 minus 3x, you might mix up which numbers are your A, B, and C. So just be careful with that. You always want it in standard form. Right? Once you have your A, B, and C, now you can just go ahead and plug it into your quadratic formula. Right? It starts off with the opposite of B. Just think back to chapter 8 when we had negative B over 2A. You're always swapping your sign there. So you have that negative 3. It's going to swap to positive 3 plus or minus. I've got the square root of b squared. So make sure you use parentheses there. Negative 3 squared minus 4 times A is 7, times C is 8. All over 2 times A, which is 7. Right? And I'm not going to solve this one out. For this one, I just wanted to show you how do you plug in those different values? How do you actually get set up here with your quadratic formula? All right. We'll get into the discriminant. We'll worry about that on the day 2. And we have a nice little cheat sheet here of these different methods that we can use to solve these different quadratics. So we talked about factoring way back in chapter 7. We talked about factoring. Okay, that's when we have something nice and simple like x squared plus x plus 20. Okay, I know the factors of 20 that add up to 1 are going to be 5. Oh, that's not my sign. It's got to be negative 20 on this one. Okay, x plus 5, x minus 4. You set each one equal to 0. Right? That would be how we solve with factoring. Okay? Sometimes it's not always easily factored, and sometimes you can't even factor it, at least not with whole numbers. All right, so factoring doesn't always work. We've got graphing. Okay, that's easy enough when you have the graph in front of you. Sometimes you're not going to have that. Sometimes you're not going to have access to a graphing calculator, to Desmos, to whatever. That works when you have those tools, but we may not have our exact intercepts as we're graphing. So for these more and more complex equations, it may not work. Square roots are great, but see the format they have to be in for us to solve? It's got to be x squared equal to some value, okay, 17 or whatever we have. The second you have an x squared and an x term, all of a sudden now we can't use square roots to solve that, right? Doesn't work. It only can be solved if you just have x squared or, x plus 3, something being squared, all equal to some value. Once you have just a plain old x term, square roots don't work anymore. Completing the square, we did not do, right? So really now we're left with quadratic formula. If you see something obvious, if you have a graph available to you, if you can see that it can be factored, you can see it's in that square root format, awesome. But the quadratic formula kind of fills in the gaps for all the other types of equations that may not be as simple as a nice easy to factor, or it's not in the square roots. Quadratic formula works for anything, right? It does take a little bit of time sometimes to do the calculations. That's really the only drawback with quadratic formula. All right, it says, let's solve our equation with our quadratic formula. It says round to the nearest tenth if necessary. So that's where we're going to round if we end up with not just a straightforward answer. All right, let's do number 1. Just a nice straightforward. It's all equal to 0 for us. I can see already that some of these I'd have to do a little bit of algebra to get this all into standard form. This one is nice and straightforward, so that's the first one I'm going to do. I've got my A, my B, and my C. Okay, so I have negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. So I'm going to start plugging in. I've got the opposite of B. I've got negative 10 as my B, so I'm going to use positive 10 plus or minus the square root of B squared, so of negative 10 squared minus 4. Keep making sure that your radical keeps going out. It's not just the square root of this part, it's the square root of that whole thing. Okay, so negative 4 times A. Don't put in x or x squared as A. Your A is just 1. And then our C is 16. All right, all over 2A. 2 times 1. All right, so we've plugged it in. Now we just have to go through and do the math. And it does take a little bit of time sometimes, which is all right. Got that 10 still, plus or minus. I've got negative 10 squared, which is positive 100. Okay, I've got negative 4 times 1, which is negative 4. And then negative 4 times 16 is negative 64. Right, over 2 times 1, which is 2. Right, looks like it's giving us nice numbers on this one. Awesome. All right, I have 10 plus or minus the square root. I get 10 plus or minus the square root. I get 36 over 2. All right, 10 plus or minus the square root of 36 gets me 6 over 2. Here is where I'm going to split this into positive and negative. So I'll have one where it is 10 plus 6 over 2, and I have one where it's 10 minus 6 over 2. All right, 10 plus 6. I get 16 divided by 2 to get 8. And I have 4 divided by 2 to get 2. All right, so those are my two answers. If you are super good at factoring, you might have looked at number 1 and seen that this one does factor. It's the same answers I would have got if I did factor. On a lot of these, though, they're not going to factor nicely. The quadratic formula is going to be the only way we can solve these out. All right. Let's go. All right, in 8 through 10, it's telling me to use the discriminant to find the number of real solutions. I'm not going to do that. I just want to use one of these equations and solve it out. I don't think I'm going to get a nice answer on one of these, which is great because a lot of your homework, you don't just get some nice, easy answer like we did on the previous one. All right, so one more example, and then we should be good to go for the day 1. Right, I've got x squared plus 3x plus 8 equal to 0. So again, I'm thinking of my A, B, and C. Sorry, I just had technical difficulties. All right, A, B, and C. So I have A, B, and C. Remember, my A is 1. I don't want to put x or x squared on anything. All right, so I get x equals opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All right, so I'm going to start off by plugging in a negative b. So my b is positive 3, so I'm going to use negative 3 plus or minus, I've got the square root of b squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 8, all over 2a, 2 times 1. Alrighty, so I've got x equals negative 3 still, plus or minus the 3 squared, I'm going to change to 9. 4 times 8, I get negative 32 all over 2. Okay, so my x is equal, I've got negative 3 plus or minus, I've got the square root 9 minus 32. I get negative 23 over 2. This is kind of where you have to take a step back and think, okay, this is back to thinking about my square roots. I have a square root of a negative number, right? Square roots of negative numbers don't really compute. Remember, you have to go and use imaginary numbers. We're not going to do all that. We see this, the square root of negative 23, and we don't have to do any more calculations. We already know this is a no solution. Really, we could say no real solution, because like I said, we could have imaginary solutions. I wouldn't count you wrong if you said no solution. All right, so if you get that negative square root, you know that that is going to be a no solution. All right. Let's see. Let's look at maybe number 6 here. I'm trying to find one that maybe gives us a messy number just so we can kind of see, like we'll probably see on our homework, what it looks like when the numbers don't just give us 2 nice whole numbers. So the first thing that we see we need to do here on number 6, we see that this is not in standard form, so we need to go ahead and move that 6 over. All right, we have that over here. We are going to go ahead, we can subtract that 6 here from each side. I get negative 4x plus 8x plus 6 equal to 0. Now I can think I have my A, B, and C. I can go ahead and plug that in. I'm going to go way over here, so I have plenty of room. Got my negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. Alrighty, so I'm going to say I have my B is 8, so negative B opposite B is going to be negative 8. Plus or minus, I've got B squared, so 8 squared minus 4AC. So minus 4 times negative 4 times 6 all over 2A. All right, x equals, I've got negative 8 plus or minus the square root, I've got 64. And then negative 4 times 6. Got to think this way. So negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16 times 6. Okay, so since it's positive, I'm now adding. Be careful with your sign. That's the easiest place to mess this up probably, is that minus 4AC. You've got 3 numbers you're multiplying. You're going to have all types of signs. Just be super careful with that. Negative 4 times negative 4 got me positive 16 times 6 gets me 96. Okay, positive 96. And then for some reason, I always forget to plug in my A. I should have plugged that in on the first step. My A is negative 4. Okay, so I can multiply that. 2 times negative 4 gets me negative 8. I'm going to keep on simplifying. I'm going to add that 64 and 96 to get 160. So negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 160 all over negative 8. All right, now I have to use my calculator. I'm going to get a decimal here. Let's see what the square root of 160 is. I get 12. It wanted me to round to the nearest tenth, so I'm going to just do 12.6. All divided by negative 8. All right, I'm going to have 2 different ones now. I'm going to go ahead and split it into my plus and minus. So negative 8 plus 12.6 divided by negative 8. And negative 8 minus 12.6, all divided by negative 8. Okay, I'm going to do my math here. Negative 8 plus 12.6, I get 4.6. And let's see what I get when I divide that by negative 8. I get negative 0.575, so I'm going to round that to negative 0.6. Alrighty, now I'm going to go to my negative. I have negative 8 minus 12.6 gives me negative 20.6. You're going to want to make sure you have a calculator on these. Okay, divided by negative 8. And that gets me positive 2.575. So I'm going to round that to 2.6. All right, so I have my 2 answers. I'm not sure how many of your homework problems look more like these, where you get nice square numbers, or more like these decimal answers. Okay, but you should probably get a mix of both. We'll talk about, maybe do 1 or 2 more examples on the day 2, plus talk about the discriminant. Again, you have your day 1 and day 2 assignments. Those are your last homework assignments for chapter 9. And just make sure you're getting prepared for that test that you will take that last Wednesday or Thursday before Memorial Day. All right, I'll see you guys soon.